They thought she'd stay quiet, just another black woman in a nice coat walking through a mall that never questioned who stared, only who they stared at. The lights were soft, the music calm, the floor polished like truth had no place to stick. 2 guards, 1 false report, and a silence they mistook for guilt. But when the badge fell, the silence broke. This isn't just her story, it's a mirror, a reminder that some people carry justice in their posture, not in their voice. That truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to drop at the right time. She didn't argue, she didn't beg, she stood. And in standing, she exposed everything. Now it's your turn to witness it. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The mall was already buzzing when Evelyn Rhodes stepped through the glass doors, her steps quiet but steady, the kind of stride that belonged to someone who had nothing to prove, yet everything to protect. A warm gust of artificially scented air brushed past her, carrying the faint aroma of buttered pretzels, fabric softener, and floor polish scents that mingled to form the oddly comforting signature of any suburban shopping center on a Friday afternoon. Above her, recessed lights flickered faintly under the high ceiling, and the soft tinkle of piano music echoed from overhead speakers, pretending to calm a crowd that was never truly calm. Parents juggled strollers and shopping bags, teenagers hovered around kiosks pretending not to look bored, and security guards posted at various corners surveyed the crowd with the vague authority of men more concerned with presence than purpose. Evelyn wore a charcoal-gray trench coat that hugged her frame with quiet elegance, and her silver-streaked natural curls were pulled into a loose bun at the nape of her neck, framed by pearl earrings that shimmered under the light, like droplets of defiance. She walked with that unshakable calm that only comes from surviving enough storms to know how to read the sky. In her left hand, she clutched a folded shopping list written in her grandson's handwriting letters, tilted, uneven, charmingly chaotic. Jacket that zips, it said, not itchy and blue if possible. That note wasn't just a reminder, it was a mission, the kind that made her tolerate the buzzing mall, the long lines, the aching joints, and now the stares. She noticed the first glance near the food court, a young mall cop with a shaved head and too much radio gear clipped to his belt, tapping his finger against his clipboard like he was waiting for a reason to act. His gaze didn't linger long, but it was precise, practiced like he'd been told what to look for, and she fit the mold. Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't change her pace. But her chest tightened just slightly the way it always did when she felt herself being reduced not to a woman, not to a grandmother, not even to a customer, but to a profile, a possibility, a problem. As she entered the upscale children's boutique near the center wing, she felt the shift in air before she saw it. The scent of eucalyptus and lavender diffused from an automatic dispenser hidden behind a planter near the cash register, and every surface inside glistened with the over-clean polish of a store that didn't expect her kind to linger. Evelyn's footsteps fell gently on the polished floor as she moved toward the outer racks where the jackets hung her fingers, brushing across the fabric with care and purpose. She picked up a small navy jacket, quilted warm, the right size for a growing boy, and held it against her chest, tilting her head as if imagining it wrapped around her grandson's tiny frame. A voice sliced through the ambient music, measured but unmistakably pointed. "Can I help you find something, ma'am?" The saleswoman was white, early 30s, sharp blonde bob lips, painted in a matte nude tone that matched the tension in her expression. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and the way she stood too straight, too close, wasn't about assistance. It was about assertion. "I'm just looking," Evelyn said calmly, meeting her gaze with neither challenge nor submission. "I'll let you know if I need anything." The woman didn't respond right away. She just nodded once tightly, then walked behind the counter and picked up the store phone, turning slightly so Evelyn couldn't see which button she pressed. Evelyn saw it anyway. She always saw it. These moments didn't surprise her anymore. They simply joined a long chain of remembered silences, each link forged from years of being trailed in drugstores, watched in department stores, second-guessed at checkout lines. And yet she stayed. She moved toward the mirror in the corner, holding the jacket up to eye level, not out of indecision, but to give herself a moment to breathe, to steady her heartbeat against the storm she felt approaching. As she moved to the register with the jacket folded neatly in her arms, she noticed a figure outside the store window, another security guard. This one broader, older, his expression unreadable. He wasn't looking at the store. He was looking at her. Evelyn exhaled through her nose, calm, focused, but her fingers tightened slightly around the jacket. She handed it to the cashier, paid in full with her card, took the printed receipt, and tucked it gently into the side pocket of her handbag. She said thank you. She smiled. She walked out. And that was when she felt it, not a sound, not a touch, but a tightening of space around her. The sudden way people stopped moving, the way conversations paused mid-sentence, as if something invisible had just stepped into place behind her. She heard heavy footsteps gaining speed, and a voice rising behind her like a slow-building siren. "Hey, stop right there," I said, "stop." She turned, and when she saw the face behind the voice, that same mall cop from earlier, cheeks, flushed eyes fixed on her bag as if it were ticking, she knew this was no misunderstanding. This was a script, and her part once again was the suspect. She stood still, watching the people around her begin to shift, to whisper, to film. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered how many of them would post this without asking what came before, how many would click share before they clicked think. And as the second guard arrived, flanking her on the other side, Evelyn did not raise her voice. She did not beg. She simply looked at them both and said, "I have my receipt," but her voice was barely audible over the weight of their presumption. The air in the mall seemed to shift the moment Evelyn turned to face the two men, one charging toward her with authority in his boots, the other following 2 steps behind, radio in hand but not yet speaking. A cluster of shoppers slowed near the fountain just ahead, their eyes flicking between the scene unfolding, and their phones unsure whether they were witnesses or just part of the background noise. The taller officer with a nameplate that read Denton pointed at her shopping bag with a firmness that wasn't just about suspicion, it was a pre-written accusation delivered without evidence, but with the full weight of presumption. "I need you to come with us," he said, and although his voice wasn't raised, it carried that clipped tone of someone who assumed he didn't need to explain himself. Evelyn didn't move. She reached slowly into her coat pocket, pulled out the folded receipt, and held it out without a word, letting the paper flutter slightly in the air-conditioned breeze, as if to say, "This is all I owe you." Denton didn't even look at it. His eyes remained locked on her face, like the receipt was irrelevant, like the gesture itself offended him. She could feel the shift in energy around her, how the space between her and the rest of the mall began to thicken, not with noise, but with the absence of it. Conversations faded, footsteps slowed, and the mall's soft piano soundtrack became suddenly intrusive, out of place, in a scene that was no longer about shopping but about control. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again," Denton added, taking a step closer. "If you cooperate, this'll be quick." Evelyn blinked once, not out of defiance, but to ground herself in the moment, to remind herself that staying composed was not weakness. It was wisdom forged from years of navigating these exact kinds of rooms without wall. "You're making a mistake," she said softly, her voice level, almost tender, like someone pointing out a stain on a stranger's shirt rather than defending her dignity. The second officer, whose badge read Sanchez, looked away briefly, his eyes scanning the nearby food court as if he hoped to find someone else in charge. Evelyn saw it in his face, the hesitation, the internal doubt, and she nearly held onto it until Denton leaned in, lowered his voice, and said something that chilled her deeper than the air blowing from the overhead vents. "People like you always find a way to make this harder than it needs to be." That phrase, "people like you," didn't scream, didn't push, didn't shove, but it pulled the entire floor out from beneath her feet. It wasn't just about theft anymore. It was about the story they had already told themselves, a story she didn't write but was now expected to act out. She took a deep breath, slow, and even then nodded, not in agreement, but in acceptance of the fact that this moment could not be unraveled with logic or receipts. As they walked flanked on either side, she noticed a woman in her 50s watching from the bench near the smoothie stand, phone raised halfway, uncertain whether to film. Their eyes met. The woman looked down. Evelyn didn't blame her. Silence, after all, is the oldest form of survival. The walk to the security office was short but stretched endlessly in her body. Every step felt like a sentence passed without trial. and the polished tiles beneath her feet clicked with each heel like punctuation marks in a story she'd read too many times. Sanchez kept a slight distance, his gaze mostly forward, but Denton stayed close, one hand near his belt, the other swinging just loosely enough to suggest restraint he hadn't yet used, but was prepared to. As they passed a group of young boys tossing popcorn into the air, Evelyn caught a single whispered line. Guess someone got caught stealing, and she knew it wasn't meant to be cruel, just casual, the kind of line that gets thrown around without thought, without pause, without cost. Inside the security office, the lighting was harsh and sterile, buzzing faintly with the kind of artificial hum that made the room feel more like a basement than a space attached to a public mall. The walls were off-white, the chairs cheap vinyl, and the air carried the dry scent of worn carpet and old paperwork. Evelyn sat without being asked, placing her handbag carefully on the table in front of her, not because she was submissive, but because she knew the rules of these moments. Every move deliberate, every gesture archived in someone's memory, whether they realized it or not. Denton remained standing, arms crossed, shifting slightly from one foot to the other like he was bracing for something. "We've had a report from one of the stores," he began, but Evelyn cut him off, not with a voice raised, but with a question posed quietly, clearly. "Did anyone verify the footage before bringing me here?" Denton hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough to confirm what she already suspected. This wasn't about facts, it was about theater. And she had been cast without audition. "I didn't steal anything," she added, her tone still controlled. "I paid, I have my receipt, and if this is about something else, I'd like to know now." Sanchez shifted behind her, clearly uncomfortable, now rubbing his fingertips along the seam of his pocket, as if hoping something in there might offer guidance. Denton didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, gestured toward the bag, and said, "We're going to take a look at what you're carrying. For everyone's safety." The phrase landed like a velvet-covered hammer. Evelyn sat up straighter, nodded once, and watched as the first layer of the trap unfolded, not with sirens or accusations, but with the quiet efficiency of a system that didn't need to scream to do damage. It just needed to be believed. And right now, the only truth in the room was how easily suspicion had filled the space where courtesy should have been. The mall courtyard, normally a blur of strollers, escalator chimes, and ambient pop music, had shifted into something far more still, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Evelyn stood at the center of it, all shoulders relaxed, but spine unyielding with the weight of two security guards closing in from either side, like a slow-forming trap she'd seen too many times before. The polished tiles beneath her feet caught the reflection of her trench coat, and somewhere in the background, a fountain bubbled on with mechanical cheer, unaware that human dignity was quietly unraveling in its shadow. Denton's voice, sharp but eerily polite, cut across the space with theatrical certainty. "You need to come with us, ma'am. This won't take long if you cooperate." His phrasing sounded practiced, like a man who had said these words before, and learned how to make them sound like procedure rather than pressure. Evelyn met his eyes with the kind of calm that comes from knowing panic is what they're hoping for, knowing they expect a raised voice, a trembling hand, anything that will validate the story they've already written about her. She considered just for a second, reaching again for the receipt tucked safely in her coat, but something about the tilt of Denton's jaw and the stillness of Sanchez's gaze told her it wouldn't matter. The receipt wasn't the point anymore, it never had been. What mattered now was her silence, or more specifically, whether they could turn that silence into suspicion. She exhaled softly and nodded once, not because she agreed, but because sometimes walking forward is the only way to stay standing. As she began to move, people parted before her, like the tide before a shipwrecked curiosity, shimmering in their eyes but weighed down by the need not to get involved. Some stared, others pulled their phones halfway out of their pockets but didn't hit record, unsure whether they were witnessing a real incident or just another uncomfortable moment best left alone. A woman in a navy blue cardigan muttered to her daughter, "Don't look," as if the act of noticing was somehow impolite, while a teenage boy near the pretzel stand whispered, "Is she stealing?" to no one in particular. Evelyn heard it all. Not every word, but the tones, the assumptions, the choreography of people deciding whether she was a threat or just inconvenient. Her heels clicked against the floor as she walked between the guards, and each step echoed longer than it should have, like the mall was making sure no one missed the sound of judgment arriving. Sanchez stayed a step behind, still avoiding eye contact, while Denton led the way with a confidence that made it clear he expected no resistance, no complication, just compliance, wrapped in a coat too fine for someone like her to be wearing without question. As they reached the edge of the main corridor, Evelyn glanced sideways at a mirrored column and caught her reflection poised, restrained, and surrounded. She looked like someone in control, and yet everything around her was designed to convince the world she wasn't keyed. Denton opened a side door marked authorized personnel only and gestured for her to enter first, and for a brief moment she hesitated, not out of fear but out of the need to register the threshold she was about to cross. Behind her were food courts, children's laughter, and storefronts trying to sell joy. Ahead was silence, fluorescent light, and the knowledge that whatever happened next would not be witnessed by anyone willing to speak up. Inside, the corridor was narrow and windowless, lined with scuffed linoleum, and the faded hum of old ceiling vents pushing cold air downward. The door clicked shut behind her, and the quiet that followed was heavy, the kind that didn't wait for permission to settle. Evelyn walked steadily following Denton past a series of unmarked doors, until they stopped in front of one with a small keycard reader and a keypad with worn digits. He swiped his badge, punched in a code, and held the door open like a doorman in a hotel he didn't own. The room inside was bare, except for a table, 3 plastic chairs, and a camera that hung from the ceiling with a small red light blinking in the corner, except that the lens was covered by a dusty slip of opaque plastic, a detail Evelyn clocked instantly. This wasn't an official interrogation room. It was a performance space, a room built for narratives, not truth. Denton motioned toward the chair closest to the door. "Go ahead and have a seat," he said, still using that flat procedural tone that disguised how much he believed he was in control. Evelyn didn't sit. Instead, she placed her handbag on the table with deliberate care and stood beside it, her hands folded in front of her eyes, scanning the walls, the corners, the distance between the guards and the exit. She had been in rooms like this before, just never as the one being watched. Sanchez lingered near the door, fidgeting slightly, eyes darting between her and his partner, like he was still deciding how committed he was to this storyline. Denton, on the other hand, pulled out a small notepad not to write, but to flip it open in a way that signaled intention. "Before we begin," Evelyn said, her voice clear, composed, "I'd like to know what exactly I'm being accused of." There was a pause, brief but telling, as Denton blinked slowly, then replied. "A store associate claimed you walked out with an item that wasn't paid for." His eyes didn't flinch, but his jaw twitched ever so slightly. "We're just trying to clarify the facts, that's all." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying him, not the words but the delivery, the cracks in the script. "And did anyone check the cameras before pulling me out in front of dozens of people?" she asked. No answer. "Not right away." Denton looked at Sanchez, who suddenly found something interesting on the floor near his feet. That silence to Evelyn said more than any explanation could. She sat down then, not out of surrender, but because choosing the chair gave her control of the moment. Her back stayed straight, her chin level, her eyes locked onto Denton's with the quiet force of someone who had lived long enough to know that dignity doesn't come from how others treat you, it comes from refusing to let them take it. The door clicked again, this time louder, as if the room itself had decided to bear witness. And for the first time, Evelyn realized that the only person who might record the truth of what was coming next was herself. The walls in the security room didn't echo. They absorbed sound like old secrets buried beneath layers of paint, the kind that had been touched up too many times to hide the cracks. Evelyn stepped in slowly, letting her eyes adjust to the sterile overhead lights, which cast everything in a harsh white that made even the beige walls seem colder than they should have been. The air was dry, recirculated as if it had been held in that room far too long, stripped of freshness, just like the sense of fairness that should have greeted anyone walking in. There were no clocks, no windows, no signs of where you were or how long you'd be kept there, only the soft hum of electricity and the occasional creak of the ceiling vent stuttering above her head. She took stock quickly, one stainless steel table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs made of hard gray plastic, and a small filing cabinet in the corner with a crooked drawer and a lock that dangled like it had never been used. The far wall had a black dome camera installed near the ceiling, but the red light was off, and the way the lens was angled told her it wasn't meant to record anything, it was meant to suggest it might. Denton gestured toward one of the chairs like a host pretending to offer hospitality. "You can sit," he said, and though it sounded like an option, it felt like an instruction buried inside a warning. Evelyn stayed standing for a moment longer, placing her handbag gently on the table with both hands, her fingers lingering on the strap, not from hesitation but from intention. She wanted them to see that nothing in her hands trembled, that no part of her body betrayed fear, even if her stomach was tightening into something that felt like a closed fist. Sanchez entered next, closing the door with a soft but unmistakable click, and that sound, barely louder than a whisper, sent a quiet message through the room. "You're inside now, and what happens next doesn't belong to the public anymore." Denton stood at the end of the table, arms crossed, watching her with a kind of smug patience, like he was waiting for her to break character, waiting for the mask he thought she wore to slip. He didn't ask her name, he didn't ask for ID. He didn't start with questions. Instead, he reached into the drawer of the cabinet, pulled out a pair of blue nitrile gloves, and began slipping them on with deliberate slowness, each snap at the wrist echoing just enough to feel like punctuation in a sentence that hadn't been spoken yet. "We're going to need you to remove your coat and place it on the table," he said, his tone cool and empty, the kind of voice that didn't need to raise volume to assert control. Evelyn looked at him carefully, then nodded once, and began unfastening her buttons, each motion unhurried, each movement precise, like she was folding away, not just fabric, but the layers of assumption that had already been stacked on her. She placed the coat on the table smooth and neat, then returned her gaze to his face, not defiantly, not submissively, just evenly like a mirror, waiting to be looked into. Denton didn't blink. "Now the bag," he added. Sanchez stepped forward and reached for it before she could respond, but she placed a hand on it first. "I'll open it," she said, calm but unmistakably clear, and the way her voice landed in that room, steady, unshaken, made Sanchez pause. He stepped back slightly, and she unzipped the bag, laying it open like she was displaying evidence she had no reason to hide. Inside were simple things: a leather wallet, a folded receipt, a phone charger, 2 tubes of hand cream, a paperback novel with the spine worn thin, and a neatly wrapped gift box tied with blue ribbon. Denton leaned forward and began moving the items one by one with his gloved hands, not roughly, but with that practiced detachment of someone pretending this was routine, even though his eyes kept searching for something more. He opened her wallet without asking, flipping through cards, pulling out her driver's license, and glancing at the photo with a blank expression. "You travel light," he said, not quite a question, more of a commentary disguised as casual. Evelyn didn't answer. She just watched, her hands resting quietly on her knees, her breathing slow and intentional. Sanchez reached for the gift box, turning it over once, then setting it aside. "What's in here?" he asked. "A jacket for my grandson," Evelyn replied. "It's his birthday this weekend." Her voice didn't shift when she said it, didn't dip into sentiment or defense. It simply stated a fact that neither man seemed interested in believing. Denton finished searching the bag and stepped back, but his body didn't relax. His stance was still tight, still ready, as if her calmness was a challenge to his authority, as if her stillness unsettled him more than resistance ever could. He circled the table once, then leaned against the edge and folded his arms again. "Where were you before entering the boutique?" he asked. "The bookstore," Evelyn replied. "I bought a novel, then went to the children's store. You can check the timestamps." Denton said nothing. He wasn't listening for truth, he was listening for contradiction. Evelyn knew this game. She'd seen it play out from the other side of the desk in training rooms, where protocol and prejudice were separated by nothing more than how well you knew how to smile. The silence stretched between them, long and thin, until Sanchez finally spoke softer this time. "We're just trying to figure out what happened. We had a report, that's all." Evelyn looked at him, her expression unreadable, and asked, "Did the report include a description? Did it include any proof? Or just a feeling?" Neither man answered. Instead, they exchanged a brief glance, one that said enough without words. And in that moment, Evelyn understood what this was. Not an investigation, not a misunderstanding, but a test. A test of how long she could hold her composure while her dignity was dissected under fluorescent light. She adjusted the sleeve of her blouse, crossed one ankle over the other, and said quietly, "If this is all based on someone's assumption, I suggest you check the cameras before you go any further." Denton shifted slightly, irritation flickering behind his eyes. "We'll do what we need to," he said, but his voice had lost something, certainty maybe, or control. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't need to. The room was already changing. Not because she had said something explosive, but because she hadn't. And sometimes silence, when used with precision, speaks louder than proof. Denton didn't speak for several seconds after Evelyn's last sentence. He just stood there, arms folded, eyes scanning her face, not in search of a lie, but of weakness, something he could exploit, a hesitation, a flicker of doubt, anything to confirm the script he already believed. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was tactical, the kind of pause that carried weight, not from what was being said, but from what both sides were refusing to give. Evelyn sat still, hands relaxed in her lap, back straight, face, composed breathing, measured like someone who understood that composure in this room wasn't just a matter of dignity, it was survival. Sanchez fidgeted behind Denton, rubbing his thumb along the edge of his glove, eyes darting back and forth like a bystander, slowly realizing the rules of the game had shifted. Then, with an audible breath through his nose, Denton moved again. He stepped forward and reached into the pocket of Evelyn's neatly folded coat that still lay on the table, and in that moment Evelyn's fingers curled slightly, not in panic, but in calculation. She had allowed them to dig through her bag, touch her belongings, inspect her wallet, her receipt, her grandson's gift. But now they were crossing into something else, into the personal terrain that people like Denton didn't realize had borders. He slipped his hand inside the inner lining, brushing past the fabric like he was searching for contraband in a coat, too quiet to be dangerous, and that's when it happened. A small polished piece of metal slid from the fabric and clinked softly against the edge of the table before bouncing to the floor with a sound that was neither loud nor sharp, but which carried the unmistakable weight of significance. All three of them froze. It was a sound that didn't belong in this kind of room. Not the sterile snap of latex, not the dull thud of wallets and receipts, but a clean metallic chime like something sacred being mishandled. Denton looked down first, eyes narrowing as if his mind couldn't yet process what he saw lying near the leg of the table. It was a rectangular badge, silver matte, slightly worn at the corners, engraved with a federal seal and a single name, Evelyn M. Rhodes, Department of Justice, Office of Civil Rights Special Counsel. For a moment, no one moved. Even the hum of the vent overhead seemed to dull, as if the room itself had registered the shift in authority. Sanchez took half a step back, his mouth slightly open, eyes now fixed on the badge like it was glowing. Evelyn didn't reach for it immediately. She let it sit there for a breath, long enough for them to fully absorb what it meant, long enough for them to understand exactly what they had just done. Then she stood slowly, gracefully, stepped around the table, and knelt with quiet precision to pick it up. Not hurried, not theatrical, just a simple, controlled motion of someone reclaiming what was hers. She held it between her fingers, brushed off an invisible speck of dust, then slipped it into the inner pocket of her coat, where it had rested all along. When she finally looked up, her eyes didn't flash with triumph or anger. They remained calm, clear, and cold, the kind of gaze that didn't demand an apology but left no room for anything else. "Do you want to continue?" she asked, her voice soft, nearly gentle, but in that room it landed like a gavel. Denton didn't respond. His posture had changed entirely. The stiff confidence that had carried him through the first half of the encounter now hung loose on his shoulders like a uniform that no longer fit. Sanchez glanced at him, waiting for direction, but none came. The silence in the room thickened, not just with shame, but with the sudden awareness of consequences, real ones. Denton looked like he wanted to speak, but the words caught somewhere between his throat and his pride. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't fill the space with more words. She didn't lecture or explain. She simply stood there with her coat still folded, her badge returned to its rightful place, and the weight of the truth now fully shifted to the other side of the table. After what felt like a full minute, Sanchez broke the silence. We didn't know you were with the DOJ, he muttered, his voice tight, uncertain, like a student caught cheating on a test he thought no one would grade. Evelyn didn't flinch. You didn't need to know, she replied, her tone quiet but deliberate. You just needed to treat me like a human being before you tried to decide what I was. Her words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled into the air like smoke, hanging there long after she stepped back to her chair and slowly slipped her coat back on. Every movement she made now was deliberate, not for effect, but for control, a way of reasserting presence without needing to prove anything. Denton stayed where he was, still silent, still shrinking in posture, the gloves on his hands now feeling less like tools of authority and more like reminders of a line crossed too far, too casually. Evelyn adjusted her collar, checked the placement of her badge one last time, then met their eyes again, not with accusation but with clarity. This room has no cameras, she said evenly, but I do remember everything. And I write things down. That was it. No threat, no escalation. Just truth spoken plainly, the way only someone with real power can afford to do. Neither man followed her as she stepped toward the door. No one dared stop her. And as her hand touched the handle, she paused for a beat long enough to let them wonder whether this was the end or just the beginning. Then she turned it gently, walked through, and let the door close behind her with a soft but final click, like the closing of a case file they never got to write. When Evelyn stepped out of that room, she didn't move quickly, didn't glance back, didn't rush to reclaim control, because control, as it turned out, had never left her. The corridor outside was exactly as it had been before, narrow, sterile, humming with fluorescent light, and chilled by forced air. Yet it somehow felt quieter now, as if the building itself had been holding its breath and was only just beginning to exhale. Her heels clicked softly on the linoleum, measured and sure, and with each step, the heat that had pooled in her chest inside that room began to settle, not disappearing, but transforming into something clearer, colder, more focused. She could still feel the silence behind her, heavy and awkward, like two men, suddenly unsure of how they'd ended up on the wrong side of their own protocol. Their power hadn't been taken. It had simply been shown for what it truly was: shallow, reactive, and easily rattled when met with a presence that didn't cower. And that was the part they would remember, the fact that she hadn't raised her voice, hadn't cursed, hadn't demanded anything at all. All she did was stand. And when someone stands with that much clarity, it becomes a mirror, and what it reflects is often unbearable. As she exited the security hallway and re-entered the public area of the mall, she noticed how the world outside hadn't changed. Parents still herded their kids toward the play area. A teenager balanced a soda and a phone while walking backwards, and the woman from earlier near the smoothie stand stood in the same spot, only now staring more directly, her eyes fixed, with a question she couldn't bring herself to ask aloud. Evelyn didn't give her a second glance, not out of pride, but because she had nothing left to explain. She walked with purpose, not to escape, but to arrive, to reappear in the world that had just moments ago watched her be led away as if she were something to be removed. And now that same world watched her return, not vindicated by a loud declaration or an apology shouted over a loudspeaker, but by the way she held her head, the slow, precise way she adjusted her coat, the badge tucked away once again like a secret only the foolish had ignored. As she passed the boutique where it all began, the saleswoman who had made the call stood behind the register, her mouth slightly open, her body frozen like a person caught mid-thought. Evelyn didn't stop. She didn't confront. She didn't even let her eyes rest there longer than needed. The look she gave as she passed, calm, direct, unflinching, said more than any accusation could. "You thought I wouldn't come back through here. You were wrong." She paused just outside the store's entrance, took a slow breath, and let her fingers graze the strap of her handbag, grounding herself in the feel of something familiar. A couple passed by, glanced at her, then looked away quickly, unsure whether she was a victim or a villain, because in public spaces like these, most people only understand what they're told to understand. And when the story changes mid-scene, they don't quite know what to do with it. Evelyn turned and made her way toward the center court where the mall's skylight cast long, geometric shadows across the floor. She found a bench, set her bag beside her, and sat just like any other shopper might. Around her life resumed its rhythm keys, jingling escalators, humming a child asking for ice cream, and yet her stillness carried a gravitational pull, subtle but undeniable. People noticed, even if they didn't know why. She looked out over the atrium and thought not about what had happened, but about how many times it must have happened to others without a badge to break the narrative. How many people had been pulled into back rooms, talked over, dismissed, or discarded, simply because someone else's fear had been allowed to masquerade as fact. That thought sat with her heavier than the bag on her shoulder or the stairs she could still feel brushing against her skin. After a while, she heard footsteps approaching, slow, hesitant, the kind of walk that carried the weight of discomfort. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Denton's voice came a second later, softer than before but still wrapped in the tension of someone trying to sound composed. "Ma'am," he said, not quite making eye contact, "we appreciate your cooperation. You're free to go." Evelyn let the words hang in the air untouched, unacknowledged, because she had never been not free. And it wasn't her job to comfort the man who had just tried to strip her of that truth. She turned slightly, looked at him, not cruelly, but with the full weight of a woman who'd been through this before, who had watched men like him make mistakes, and then hoped silence would make them disappear. "Next time," she said quietly, "look first, act later." He gave a small nod, the kind that didn't mean understanding or remorse, just a weak attempt at closure. Then he walked away, his steps uneven, his shoulders no longer squared. Evelyn watched him go, not out of satisfaction, but out of study. Because sometimes power doesn't shift with noise, it shifts with stillness, and she wanted to witness the moment that realization began to take root. She stood after a few minutes, gathered her things, and headed toward the exit, her stride unhurried, her presence fully restored. She didn't need applause. She didn't want headlines. What she carried with her now wasn't justice served, but balance restored quietly, decisively, without permission or apology. And as she stepped out into the late afternoon light spilling across the parking lot, she understood something even deeper than before. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And this time she wasn't the one being watched. She was the one doing the watching. That evening, long after the shopping bags were unpacked and the receipt folded and tucked inside a kitchen drawer, Evelyn stood alone in her small living room, letting the quiet settle in like a familiar guest she no longer had to entertain. The television played softly in the background, some late-night news recap no one was really watching, but she wasn't listening to it anyway. She was watching the light shift across the hardwood floor, the way shadows stretched along the walls like memory itself was trying to whisper. Her coat hung neatly on the hook by the door badge, resting silently in its pocket, and yet her body still carried the tension of the room it had been exposed in. She reached for a photo frame on the bookshelf, one that rarely left its place, and sat down on the edge of the couch, as if it were an altar. The picture inside was old edges, curled colors fading, but the image remained sharp. Her mother standing in front of a corner store apron, still on a grocery bag tucked under one arm, and the faintest smile on her lips that couldn't quite hide how tired her eyes were. Evelyn stared at it for a long moment, letting her fingers trace the outline of her mother's shoulder in the glass, remembering not just the day the photo was taken, but the day that came after. She had been 12 years old, standing just outside that store in the light rain, waiting for her mother to finish her shift. They hadn't planned to shop. Her mother had just wanted to grab 2 fresh loaves of bread for dinner, something soft enough for soup, quick enough to carry home before the bus came. But she didn't make it past the bakery section. A young manager, fresh out of training and full of suspicion, saw her walking through without a basket and flagged her down like she'd breached something sacred. He didn't ask what she was doing. He didn't offer to check with the back. He simply waved at the security guard, a heavy-set man with bored eyes, who walked over and pulled the bread from her hands as if taking back stolen property. "Working here doesn't mean you get to take what you want," the manager had said, his voice flat, but cutting, each word landing like cold water poured straight down the spine. Evelyn's mother didn't yell. She didn't explain. She simply opened her wallet, showed her employee ID, and walked away with her head low and her dignity shattered like glass underfoot. That night they didn't eat bread. They ate noodles, and no one mentioned the incident out loud, but Evelyn could feel something had been lost that wouldn't be retrieved at any register. Her mother never went back to that job. And from that moment on, she stopped making eye contact with store clerks, stopped lingering in aisles, stopped trusting the system to see her as anything other than a risk to be monitored. Evelyn didn't understand it then, couldn't name it, but she knew what shame looked like when it didn't belong to the person who was carrying it. Years later, when she entered law school, people assumed it was because she was ambitious, smart, driven by a sense of justice. They weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't right either. What drove her wasn't the desire to wear a suit or stand behind a podium. It was the memory of standing in the rain, watching her mother swallow injustice without a single person stepping in to ask why. That silence had never left her. It had followed her into every classroom, every courtroom, every quiet pause in a deposition when someone tried to redirect the story. And it followed her into that mall too, not as fear, but as preparation. Now, sitting on the edge of her own couch decades later, she felt the same thing she'd felt back then, only more refined, sharper, polished into something almost unrecognizable. Not rage, not sorrow, but resolve. She looked down at the photo and whispered softly, "I didn't raise my voice today, Mama. I didn't need to." Her hand didn't shake, her eyes didn't tear, but something in her chest pulled tight, as if that quiet affirmation reached across time to touch a wound that had never fully healed. She placed the frame gently back in its spot, and walked into the kitchen to boil water for tea. The hum of the kettle filled the air, low and constant, grounding her like the rhythm of a heartbeat you know by instinct. As she waited, she thought not of Denton or Sanchez or the saleswoman who made the call. She thought of every woman like her mother, every grandmother, aunt, teacher, or nurse who had been forced to walk away from dignity because no one dared to see them. And she thought about what it meant to be the person who didn't walk away, not for recognition, not for revenge, but because someone had to stay standing where others had been pushed to their knees. The kettle whistled and she poured the water slowly, watching the steam rise and curl like breath returned to a cold room. She carried the cup to the window, sat on the sill, and stared into the quiet darkness outside. The world was still turning, people were still sleeping, and no headlines would mention what had happened to her that day. But that was never the point. The point was that when the time came, when the accusation was hurled, the eyes turned, the silence pressed in, she hadn't hesitated, she had remembered. And remembering in moments like that is sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do. The next morning, Evelyn returned to the mall, not because she had to, but because something inside her refused to let silence be the final word. The sun was barely rising when she parked in the same space as the day before, the lot still mostly empty, rows of vehicles scattered like forgotten thoughts. She sat in her car for a few minutes longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes unfocused as she listened to the gentle hum of the engine winding down. The air smelled faintly of rain and coffee, and in that quiet, she felt the echo of yesterday still lingering heavy, unfinished, like a breath held too long in the chest. She entered through the east side entrance where the floors were just being polished, and the smell of disinfectant clung to the air like perfume no one wanted. Janitors nodded at her, unaware of the tension that had once passed through these same halls under the mask of protocol. As she walked toward the boutique, her steps soft and deliberate, she noticed how the lighting felt different, harsher, now brighter, almost interrogative, as if the building itself remembered and had chosen sides. Inside the store, the same saleswoman stood behind the register, her blonde hair tied tighter than before, her eyes flicking upward with practiced pleasantness before freezing in recognition. The smile on her face faltered just slightly, not enough to be called fear, but enough to signal the awkward shuffle of someone unsure if they should acknowledge yesterday or pretend it never happened. Evelyn didn't say anything at first. She just approached the display where the children's jackets were still hanging neatly, running her fingers over the same navy one she'd bought this time, only looking, not buying. The silence stretched as the saleswoman fumbled with the receipt printer, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of Evelyn occupying space in her store again without explanation or apology. Finally, she spoke. "If there's anything you need, let me know," she said, her voice lighter than air, as if hoping her tone could erase the fact that she had once tried to erase Evelyn's presence altogether. Evelyn turned her head, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to meet the woman's eyes for a beat too long. "Thank you," she replied evenly, letting the words hang like a mirror. She left without buying anything. That wasn't why she came. What she needed was confirmation, not of power or vindication, but of posture. That she could walk back through those doors with her own name, her own breath, her own story unbroken. And that no one, not a guard, not a clerk, not a lie, had taken that from her. Back in the mall's central atrium, she found a bench near the fountain and sat letting the noise return around her. Slowly, shoe squeaks, voices rising and falling, distant coffee machines hissing behind counters. Life moved on, but she stayed still, and in her stillness the pressure that had followed her for decades finally began to shift, not disappear, but loosen the way a collar unbuttons after being worn too tight for too long. She thought about what the store manager would write in her daily report, if anything at all. Would she note that the woman came back, touched the same rack of coats, said almost nothing, and left as quietly as she arrived? Or would she pretend it didn't happen, just as the guards had pretended not to see the badge, just as the system? She pretended to function fairly when no one asked questions. Evelyn suspected the latter. But she also knew one thing: the report would never contain fear. Because what unnerved them the most wasn't the badge, and it wasn't even the authority behind it. It was the way she moved after they tried to take her stillness away and failed. The way she remained composed, uninterrupted, unafraid to return without asking for permission or giving a reason. That kind of resilience doesn't make headlines, but it leaves marks quiet, lasting ones like footprints in wet concrete. She stayed there a while longer, watching people pass their conversations, blending into one another, unaware that something important had happened right where they stood. An older man sat 2 benches over, sipping coffee from a paper cup, and nodded at her the way strangers do when sharing space. She nodded back. In that small exchange there was no assumption, no hesitation, no hierarchy, just human acknowledgement. And for Evelyn, that was enough. By the time she stood up and walked toward the exit, the mall had grown busier, louder, more chaotic, but her steps didn't change. She moved as she always had, with care, with awareness, with the quiet gravity of someone who no longer needed to explain why she came or what she endured. The door slid open in front of her, letting in a warm breeze that smelled faintly of pine mulch and distant traffic, and for the first time since the incident, her shoulders felt lighter, not because the weight was gone, but because she now knew exactly how much of it she could carry without breaking. And as she stepped outside into the morning light, she realized something else, something small but undeniable. Yesterday they made her a target. Today she chose to be a presence. And there is nothing more unsettling to those who trade in control than someone who refuses to disappear. It started with a sound barely louder than static, an awkward clip of cell phone footage, shaky and slightly out of focus, no more than 40 seconds long. There was no narration, no music, no editing to draw attention to what was happening, only the unmistakable image of a black woman being quietly escorted through a shopping mall corridor by 2 uniformed guards. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't shouting. She didn't even speak. But her face, her stillness, her restraint was enough to turn the internet's endless scroll into a pause. The video was posted anonymously, just a random handle with no bio, no location, no context, just the caption, "Toxic, another one." And within minutes the comments began trickling in like water, finding cracks in concrete, some quick to judge others, simply asking, what did she do? Most didn't know what they were watching, but they knew what they felt. Because the image didn't just speak it, accused it, unsettled. It reminded people of something they'd seen before, or perhaps feared might happen to someone they loved. Some dismissed it immediately. "Probably shoplifting," one user wrote, while another replied, "She doesn't look surprised. That's all I'm saying." But then something shifted. 10 minutes after the first clip went live, a second one appeared, recorded from a different angle, this time from the far end of the corridor. In it, the same woman, now seated inside a small room, held something in her hand that caught the light. It was subtle, almost easy to miss. But someone zoomed in and paused the frame, and there it was, the silver gleam of a federal badge glinting like truth pressed into metal. From there, the story didn't just spread, it exploded. Tweets, multiplied stitches, and duets on TikTok appeared by the hundreds. Instagram stories reshared the badge moment with captions like, "Know who you're dealing with, and she didn't even have to say a word." Hashtags began to form: number DOJ badge drop, number silent authority, number she stood, and underneath them, stories poured in like rainfall on dry ground. Stories from women, from men, from teenagers and elders, each one echoing the same sentiment: I've been followed too. I've been mistaken. I've been ignored when I tried to explain. Evelyn didn't know about the video at first. She didn't post, it didn't ask for attention, didn't give an interview or issue a statement. She was at home folding laundry when a colleague texted her a link with 3 words, "Is this you?" And when she watched herself being pulled through that corridor in silence, watched the badge fall, watched the moment the room changed, she didn't feel vindicated. She felt something else. She felt a strange stillness, like witnessing her own memory from the outside, like watching a version of herself step into a history she hadn't asked to carry. She closed the video before it ended, sat down at her kitchen table, and stared at her reflection in the glass of a framed photo, her mother's photo. Then she whispered to herself, they weren't ready for that. Not as a boast, not as a threat, but as a quiet observation of how power shifts when the wrong assumptions meet the right truth. By evening, major news outlets had picked up the story, not because they knew who she was, but because the public demanded answers. Articles ran with headlines like, "Federal agent mistaken for shoplifter, sparks outrage and DOJ, badge changes everything." But Evelyn knew the badge wasn't what changed things. It was the silence, the way she never had to shout to be heard, the way her calmness forced everyone else to examine their own noise. But beneath the headlines and hot takes, something deeper began to take shape, a conversation, a hard one, a necessary one. People started asking not just about Evelyn, but about the system that made her invisible until a badge made her undeniable. What if she didn't have that badge? One post asked. Would we have ever heard about her? And in that question lay the truth Evelyn had carried with her for years, that the problem wasn't that she had been stopped. The problem was how easily the world accepted it, until they were forced to see who she really was. The mall issued a vague statement within 24 hours, calling the incident an unfortunate misunderstanding, but the comment sections beneath it were brutal. "You mean you accidentally profiled a civil rights attorney?" one reply read. "What about all the other people you dragged off without a badge?" another added. And that's when Evelyn realized the real story wasn't about her anymore. It was about everyone else they had gotten away with silencing. She didn't respond online. She didn't clarify. She didn't post a video or correct the record. Instead, she began writing by hand, slowly, deliberately documenting what she had seen, what she had heard, what she remembered. Not for the internet, not for the news, but for herself, for the record. Because sometimes when the whole world finally starts to listen, the most powerful thing you can do is decide exactly what you want them to hear. And in that moment, as the story spiraled beyond her control, Evelyn sat back and realized that the badge hadn't saved her. It had only revealed what was already true. What saved her was her poise, her restraint, her refusal to become what they expected. And that, more than anything, was why the video kept spreading, because deep down, people weren't just watching what happened. They were watching what it looks like when someone takes back the narrative without ever raising their voice. By the time the viral clip had circled through newsrooms, comment threads, and dinner tables across the country, Evelyn found herself sitting in a narrow, nondescript conference room, lit by the kind of institutional fluorescence that made everyone look a little more tired than they really were. The walls were beige, the carpet an uninspired gray, and the chairs had that overly stiff back that seemed designed to remind people they were here for serious business. Across from her sat 2 investigators, one from the Department of Civil Rights and another from the Office of Inspector General, both flipping through their notes with the quiet energy of people who had read the story, seen the clip, and were now trying to measure the woman behind it. Evelyn didn't fidget. She didn't lean back. She sat with her hands gently folded on the table, waiting for the questions. Not because she owed answers, but because she understood this moment wasn't about her alone. It was about whether the system could be made to see itself. The first question was expected. When did you first realize the situation had escalated beyond a simple misunderstanding? The younger investigator asked, trying to keep his voice neutral like he hadn't already formed an opinion. Evelyn looked at him not with defiance or caution, but with the clarity of someone who had replayed the events 100 times in her mind. The moment they ignored the receipt, she said calmly, "That's when I knew they weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a reason to confirm what they already believed." The room stayed quiet for a moment, the only sound, the soft shuffle of paper and the low buzz of the overhead lights. The older investigator scribbled something in the margin of her folder, not asking a follow-up, just letting the silence stretch long enough to see what Evelyn might add. But she didn't. She had already learned that sometimes silence was the clearest form of testimony. Outside the room, the world kept spinning interviews, think pieces, public panels dissecting not just what had happened to her, but what it meant. Civil rights groups were calling for a review of private security training across the country. Community organizers were compiling testimonies from people who had endured similar treatment without ever having a badge to defend them. And on her desk at home, Evelyn had begun her own process, a deeper dive into the contracts that allowed private mall guards to operate with public authority and without public accountability. She requested internal memos, scanned budget reports, highlighted sections of security firm policies that used vague language like behavioral irregularity and non-compliant presentation terms so broad they could be applied to anyone who didn't smile at the right time or move with the expected deference. In the fine print of one lease agreement between the mall and its third-party security provider, she found a clause that quietly handed incident reporting privileges to on-site retail staff, a clause that empowered cashiers and clerks, not trained officers, to escalate perceived theft suspicions directly to mall security with no burden of verification. That clause explained everything. It explained why the sales associate's word had been taken as fact. It explained why no footage had been reviewed before she was detained. And it explained how a story like hers could have easily ended in silence if not for a badge, a bounce of metal on tile, and a camera phone held by a stranger who had no idea they were about to expose the fragile machinery of casual power. One afternoon, while reviewing city permitting records from a government website, Evelyn stumbled across a list of behavioral trigger codes used by contracted security teams to flag potential theft suspects. The codes weren't secret, but they weren't easy to find either, buried deep in a subsection labeled Procedural Efficiency Metrics. Among them were phrases like, "appeared nervous upon entry, examined merchandise, without apparent intent to purchase, and failed to maintain consistent eye contact with staff." Evelyn read them slowly one by one and realized that none of them described behavior. They described people. People like her mother, like her younger self, like the countless names that would never make headlines because they'd learned to stay quiet, to move carefully, to be small. The same kinds of people who, when confronted, were told, "You're overreacting," or "It's just a misunderstanding," or "You matched a description." But now Evelyn had the description. She had the codes. She had the paper trail. And more importantly, she had the attention. Later that week, she met with two attorneys from a coalition of civil liberties groups. They asked if she wanted to press charges, file a civil claim, demand a formal apology from the mall's corporate leadership. She considered each one carefully, not because she needed retribution, but because she knew every legal option she chose would set a precedent for someone else. "I'm not looking for a settlement," she said. "I'm looking for exposure. I want the system that lets this happen to be forced into the light." They didn't interrupt. They just nodded. She handed them copies of her findings, flag codes, internal memos, leasing language, and a map of how decision-making flowed from front counter to security corridor without ever touching due process. And in that moment, she realized she wasn't just building a case. She was building a record. A living file of how suspicion travels, how power conceals itself in normalcy, and how quickly dignity can be undone when perception is allowed to function unchecked. When the meeting ended, she stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, the city pulsing around her with its usual rhythm: horns, honking people, rushing buses, hissing against the curb. But she didn't feel like part of the noise. She felt anchored, focused. And as she pulled the door closed behind her, she whispered something only she could hear. This time they picked the wrong story to erase. The hearing room wasn't large, but it carried a silence that felt heavier than stone, the kind of silence that doesn't just hush sound but expectation. The overhead lights were bright, flat, clinical, stripping away illusion but offering no warmth, and the hum of a microphone being tested echoed once before, settling into stillness. Evelyn sat at the front, flanked by two folders on the table before her, one filled with facts, the other filled with memory. Behind her, rows of seats were taken by people who had come to witness something. They weren't quite sure how to name, some in support, some out of curiosity, and others because they knew deep down they'd seen pieces of this before and never spoken of it. She took a slow breath as the committee chair called the session into order, a soft gavel tap that landed like punctuation to a sentence already underway. Across from her sat officials from the mall's corporate legal team, stiff in gray suits and unreadable expressions, flipping through their statements with fingers that never trembled. The press sat along the back wall, their cameras lowered for now, their pens twitching in the quiet anticipation of something about to crack open. Evelyn didn't adjust her mic. She didn't clear her throat. She just leaned forward slightly and began, her voice low but steady, the tone of someone who had waited long enough for the room to be ready. "I'm not here to describe what happened to me," she said, letting each word find its place. "You've already seen it. I'm here to talk about what happens every day to people who didn't have a badge in their coat." A few heads nodded slightly, a few pens stopped moving, and in that brief pause the air shifted. She opened the first folder and laid out a printed document, the security firm's internal escalation policy, including a clause that allowed cashiers to initiate detainment protocols without visual proof of wrongdoing. "This," she continued, tapping the page gently, "is how we confuse suspicion with procedure. This is how someone's skin color becomes a silent trigger for action." The corporate lawyer across from her opened his mouth, but the chair raised a hand. "Miss Rhodes has the floor," he said. And Evelyn went on, her voice, never raising her hands, never gesturing for effect. She showed diagrams connecting the mall's operating agreement to the third-party security contract, detailing the flow of unchecked authority. She cited previous cases, buried complaints, and the language used in rejection letters, phrases like insufficient evidence, no violation of formal policy, and inconclusive camera footage, all of which meant nothing and everything at the same time. "Some of you may think this is about one incident," she said, now turning slightly toward the room, her eyes scanning the faces in front of her. "But I'm not the story. The system is, and systems don't malfunction. They function exactly as they were designed to." She paused just long enough to let that settle. Not like a punch, but like a truth that couldn't be outrun. From the back, a woman cleared her throat and shifted in her seat, visibly moved but unsure what to do with what she felt. 2 rows ahead, a young man who hadn't looked up from his phone suddenly locked eyes with her and didn't look away again. Evelyn closed the folder gently, almost ceremoniously, then folded her hands over it and looked back at the committee. "Ask yourselves this," she said. "If I hadn't been with the Department of Justice, if I didn't have that badge in my pocket, would we be sitting here today? Would anyone be reading this file? Or would I just be another anonymous customer with a note in someone's internal system that says, 'Case closed'?" The room stayed still, not because they were shocked, but because the question didn't allow for easy answers. There was no performance here, no dramatic reveal. Just one woman sitting quietly in a chair, calmly reminding them that truth doesn't need volume to be heard. The committee chair leaned forward, his glasses low on his nose, and asked in a voice more human than official, "What would you like to see happen next, Miss Rhodes?" She met his eyes without hesitation. "I want policies that can't hide behind vague language. I want oversight that doesn't rely on someone going viral. And I want every mall, every school, every public space that contracts private security to be forced to disclose how they're trained and who they're trained to see as a threat." There was a beat of silence, then another. Then from the far corner of the room someone began to clap, not loudly, not as a performance, but as a response. One person, then another. Not everyone joined in. Some sat still, unsure if it was appropriate. But it didn't matter. Evelyn wasn't counting applause. She was counting impact. When the hearing adjourned and the lights began to dim, people rose from their seats slowly, not rushing toward the exits but moving like they'd just heard something they couldn't unhear. One of the corporate attorneys nodded at her on his way out, not out of courtesy but recognition, the kind that comes when you realize the ground beneath you has shifted. Evelyn gathered her folders, tucked them under her arm, and walked toward the rear doors where the daylight spilled through frosted glass, like a quiet invitation back into the world. A reporter tried to stop her with a question, but she raised her hand gently and said, "Not now. There would be time for commentary later." For now the truth had been spoken, and that was enough. Evelyn never returned to that mall again, not because she was afraid, and not because she needed to prove a point, but because the space no longer required her presence. It had already been rewritten by her silence, her poise, and the truth she carried with her. A few months later, after the hearings had faded from the headlines and the public's attention shifted elsewhere, she quietly stepped away from her federal position, not out of defeat, but with the clarity of someone who knew that her next chapter needed a different kind of desk. She found a small space at the edge of town, inside a modest public library that still smelled faintly of paper and dust and time well spent. The room wasn't much, just a narrow office with two mismatched chairs, a wooden table, and a single window that let in enough morning light to make the walls feel less tired. But she didn't need grandeur. What she needed was reach, and what she built inside those walls wasn't an organization or a protest movement or a website. It was a place for people to come and tell the truth when no one else would write it down. She called it the listening room. No sign on the door, no press release, no grand opening. Just her a notepad and a kettle for tea. People came slowly at first. An elderly woman who'd been followed through a grocery store in silence. A young man whose job application had disappeared after one in-person interview. A school teacher pulled aside for random inspection 3 times in 1 week. They didn't come to rage. They came to be heard. And Evelyn listened, not just with her ears, but with her presence, her stillness, the way her eyes never shifted away when someone described a moment they weren't sure had really happened, or whether it mattered if it did. Behind her desk on the wall just above her left shoulder hung 2 photographs in matching frames. One was the black and white image of her mother still holding that bag of groceries outside the pharmacy, the faintest smile on her lips, as though daring the world to define her. The other was a photograph taken by a stranger the day Evelyn walked out of that mall, a side profile, her coat buttoned, her head held high, her hands empty, but her stride full of something no camera could quite capture. Between them, pinned to the wall without a frame, was her Department of Justice badge. People asked her sometimes if she missed the courtroom, missed the title, missed the authority. She would smile softly and shake her head, then say something like, "No, I carry all of that in my posture now." And it was true. She no longer needed to flash a badge to be believed. She had built something quieter, deeper, and far more difficult to undo. One afternoon, a teenage girl with anxious eyes and bitten nails sat across from her and whispered, "I don't know what to do when they make me feel small." Evelyn reached for the notepad, tore off a blank sheet, and slid it across the table. "You write it down," she said gently, "because memory matters. And if they won't record it, you will." And in that simple gesture, paper passed between hands, silence honored, instead of broken truth made visible, without needing to shout. Evelyn understood something even deeper than justice. She understood that dignity isn't something granted. It's something preserved. And as long as someone is willing to remember to sit still and bear witness to hold the silence without apology, then no lie, no badge, no title, no power can ever make the truth disappear. What happened to Evelyn Rhodes wasn't just about a mall or a badge. It was about what happens every day when people are seen, not for who they are, but for what others fear they might be. It's a reminder that injustice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in policy, hides behind procedure, or slips past us in silence. But Evelyn didn't fight back with volume. She stood with grace, carried her truth, and changed the room by refusing to vanish. For all of us watching, especially those of us who've lived long enough to know the weight of being overlooked, there's a deeper lesson here. Your voice doesn't have to be loud to matter. Your dignity doesn't depend on anyone else's permission. And your story, even when no one asks for it, deserves to be remembered. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of a moment you've carried quietly for years, or if you believe we need more spaces where truth is honored without needing to shout, go ahead and like this video, share it with someone who understands, and subscribe for more stories that matter. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply not let each other be forgotten.